Hello, everybody. Welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Today, we're diving into the fourth episode of Silver Scream to Broken Spines, where I pair some of my favorite horror movies with books that I think capture their unique vibe. We'll explore what makes these stories tick, compare the screams on screen to those on the page, and see if my selections live up to the film. If you missed my last episode, I covered The Substance, a visceral body horror descent into beauty, obsession, and self-destruction, and paired it with some equally grotesque and thought-provoking novels. You can find that video linked down below, but today we're stepping back to the 1600s with Robert Eggers' The Witch, a haunting folktale about faith, repression, and the fear of the unknown. And the book I'll be pairing it with, well, you'll just have to stay tuned to find out. Before we get into the book, though, let's talk about the movie, its atmosphere, its legacy, and why it's still one of my favorite horror films of the last decade. If you could care less about my movie yapping and just want to get to the books, I get it, you're on BookTube. You can jump ahead to this timestamp to skip all the movie talk. But everyone along for the ride, let's jump into the movie. In 2015, Robert Eggers made his directorial debut with The Witch, a New England folktale, a film that would quickly cement his reputation as one of the most distinctive voices in modern horror. Eggers grew up in New England with a fascination of folklore and a fear of witchcraft. He also had a background in theater and production design, and his meticulous attention and fascination to details of 17th century New England carried into The Witch. Set in 1630s New England, the film follows a Puritan family cast out of their settlement and forced to live in solitude in the wilderness. It draws heavily on actual colonial folklore, diaries, and sermons with dialogue adapted from 17th century texts. This commitment to authenticity gives the film its unique atmosphere, from the authentic costume and production design to the unique style reminiscence to paintings of the period. The film's themes are tied to repression, isolation, and the fear of female autonomy. Eggers described it as a story about Puritan nightmares come true, where the strict religious worldview of the family creates the horrors we see on screen. The slow, deliberate pacing, dim natural lighting, and unsettling sound design all work together to create a sense of dread that builds quietly but relentlessly until its climax. Anya Taylor-Joy, in her breakout role as Thomasin, gives an incredible performance, anchoring the film's exploration of innocence, temptation, and liberation. I think it is this performance that set the trajectory of her launch into stardom. When it premiered at Sundance, The Witch received polarizing response. Some hailed it as an instant masterpiece, while others were put off by its slow burn pacing and archaic dialogue that's difficult to follow. But over time, it has become one of the most influential horror films of the past decade, often credited with helping usher in a wave of thematically driven, art house-inspired horror, along with films like Hereditary, Get Out, and It Follows. The Witch follows a devout Puritan family in 1630s New England who are exiled from their community and forced to build a life on their own in the woods. Soon after settling, their infant son mysteriously vanishes while under the care of the eldest daughter, Thomasin. As crops fail and livestock begin acting strangely, the family grows consumed by paranoia, suspicion, with Thomasin at the center of their fears. This escalates into accusations of witchcraft, driving the family to turn against each other, as unseen evils in the woods closes in on them. Now, what makes The Witch one of my favorite horror films is how it blends historical accuracy in dialogue and actual Puritan folklore into a bleak atmospheric film that is genuinely terrifying to me. It gives the movie a sense of authenticity that is rare in horror, and it feels as if you're watching a nightmare that people in the 1600s might truly believe. Performances also elevate the film, especially Anya Taylor-Joy's debut as Thomasin, but also Ralph Ineson and Kate Dickie as the parents who ground the story with raw and unsettling intensity. Ralph Ineson just has a perfect voice for this role. At its core, The Witch is about fear, fear of sin, fear of women's independence and power. And it's an exploration of the horrors of such religious fervor. And that's why I think it continues to resonate, not just as a meticulously crafted folktale, but also as one of the most unsettling and enduring horror films of the 2010s. Now, I've talked about The Witch and why it works so well as a film, But this video is really about books, so let's talk about some I considered as potential companions. The first that came to mind was The Crucible by Arthur Miller. It's not a horror novel, it's actually a play written in 1953, but I felt like I had to bring it up when thinking about The Witch. Miller wrote The Crucible during the era of McCarthyism in the United States, using the Salem witch trial as an allegory for the Red Scare and the hysteria surrounding accusations of communism. The play dramatizes how fear, suspicion, and blind faith can destroy a community from within. Much like The Witch, the story is less about witches themselves and more about the terror created by religious paranoia. Innocent people are accused, families are torn apart, and truth becomes irrelevant once fear takes hold. Like I said, it's not horror, so there's no scares or supernatural entities, but the way hysteria spirals out of control feels deeply aligned with the same themes that Egger explores in The Witch. That said, because it's a historical drama rather than horror fiction, I didn't consider it my top recommendation, but if you're interested in the cultural and psychological roots of witch panic, or want to dig deeper into the themes of repression and paranoia and how they've been explored across history and artistic mediums, The Crucible is a great piece to check out. Another book I looked at was Cunning Folk by Adam Neville. Neville is a pretty well-known name in contemporary horror, seeming to specialize in British folk horror. So this one immediately stood out as a potential match for The Witch. I've not read from him before, but I've only heard great things. The novel follows a couple who move into a rundown house in the remote English countryside. The previous owner of the house committed suicide, but no one knows why. The couple soon discover that their neighbors are not only unfriendly, but potentially involved in ancient occult practices. The couple becomes the target of sinister rituals and malevolent forces tied to the land. What drew me to this book as a companion piece is how it uses folklore and rural isolation as a source of horror, similar to how The Witch uses Puritan fear and old world superstition. Neville is also known for his atmospheric writing and slow building tension, which feels very much in line with Robert Eggers' style. Instead of fast-paced horror, he leans into the unease of the setting and the creeping sense that something ancient and evil is shaping events. But the main reason I didn't ultimately pick Cunning Folk to read for this video is that it leans more towards the horror of domestic life than the deeply religious and historical tones of The Witch. Also, setting is important, and I was able to find better options set in colonial-era America. But that said, if you are drawn to folk horror, Cunning Folk might be an excellent choice. Next up, I considered another British folk horror novel, which is Starved Acre by Andrew Michael Hurley. This novel feels like it would share a lot in common with The Witch. The story follows a couple, Richard and Juliet, who move to Richard's childhood home in rural England. Their son dies suddenly under mysterious circumstances, and while Juliet turns for grief support from seemingly benevolent group of occultists, Richard begins investigating the land around their home. He discovers strange local folklore tied to an ancient oak tree and becomes obsessed with uncovering its secrets. The rural setting and the focus on traditions and beliefs make it seem like it would be a good recommendation to people who enjoyed The Witch. And like the film, it seems like Starved Acre is a slow burn horror that builds dread through atmosphere and is less about overt scares. Also, the book seems to mirror the way The Witch uses parental grief. In both stories, the loss of a child unravels a family already strained by isolation, leaving space for superstition and despair to take root. In both stories, grief makes these families vulnerable to forces they can't fully understand or control. But the reason I didn't ultimately choose this book is similar to Cunning Folk in its modern English setting as opposed to that of Puritan New England. And Starved Acre appears to lean more towards grief-driven horror rather than that of religious and witchcraft themes at the heart of The Witch. But again, possibly a great recommendation for fans of folk horror in general. Another book I strongly considered is The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. This one has been on my TBR for a while, and it feels like such a natural companion to The Witch. The novel follows Emmanuelle, a young woman living in Bethel, a puritanical settlement ruled by religious patriarchy. Her very existence is blasphemous to the community as she is a result of her mother's union with an outsider of a different race. She is an outcast, but does her best to live a holy life, but one day she ventures into the forbidden Darkwood, where she encounters the spirits of executed witches and receives their gift, a journal from her dead mother. From there, she begins to uncover truths about Bethel's hypocrisy and violence while wrestling her own growing connection to the witches who haunt the woods. Much like The Witch, Henderson's novel seems like it'll explore the fear and control surrounding women in the church and the terror of religious extremism. The setting of the Darkwood even mirrors the New England forest setting of Eggers' The Witch. It seems like maybe it leans more into dark fantasy than strict horror, so this is not my top choice, but a possible contender if I ultimately decide to read a second book for this video. Which leads me to my final choice, and the one I ultimately decided to read, Slewfoot by Brom. This novel is set in 1666 New England, and follows Abatha, a newly married woman whose husband dies suddenly, leaving her vulnerable in a rigid Puritan society. At the same time, something ancient and powerful awakens in the nearby woods, an entity the locals call Slewfoot. Abatha's past intertwines with this dark spirit, blurring the lines between damnation and liberation. I picked this one up because it feels like a natural companion to The Witch. Both stories are steeped in folklore and history in their settings, with Puritan repression, accusations of witchcraft, and heroines who are forced to navigate brutal patriarchal societies. And while The Witch leaves some ambiguity around whether its supernatural forces are real or imagined, Slewfoot fully embraces the mythic, leaning into witchcraft and woodland paganism. Another big draw for me is that Brom is the illustrator of this novel, and the edition I have includes his haunting artwork throughout. It was definitely hard to choose between all the books I considered, but I had a feeling Slewfoot will capture a lot of what I loved about The Witch. On paper, the connection seems strong, but I'm curious whether the tone execution will really capture that same atmosphere I'm yearning for. I'll let you know after I finish whether this truly holds up as a companion read, or if one of the other books I looked at might have been a better fit. So I just finished Slewfoot by Brom, and I think this was a fantastic choice to pair with The Witch, and just an incredible book overall. The story follows Abatha, a young Englishwoman in 1666, who is married into a strict Puritan community. After her husband's sudden death, she's left vulnerable to her brother-in-law's attempts at stealing her farm. And from here we see Abatha befriending a forest demon while her community turns against her. One of the biggest similarities between Slewfoot and The Witch is the setting. Both stories are set in 17th century New England. Because of this, you get the same sense of isolation of small communities hemmed in by the wilderness. In The Witch, it's the forest pressing in and around the family's farm. In Slewfoot, it's the woods as a place of danger where pagan rituals and ancient power resides. And with the settings, just like The Witch used period-appropriate dialogue to immerse in the Puritan world, Brom also makes an effort to echo the vernacular of the time. It never feels like parody or too stiff to follow, but it gives the story the same authenticity and weight. Both The Witch and Slewfoot thrive on that slow burn folk horror sense of dread. In The Witch, it's the wilderness pressing in on the family, fractured by faith and paranoia, where in Slewfoot it's the suspicion and hostility of a puritanical village that creates the conditions for witchcraft to take root. What surprised me though, and how Slewfoot differs from The Witch, was how Slewfoot blended this folk horror vibe with something more visceral. Brom doesn't just suggest the presence of dark forces, he brings them to life with vivid, grotesque imagery and fully realized demonic entities, with richly detailed artwork portraying them. Where The Witch is all about suggestion and ambiguity, Slewfoot leans harder into a kind of dark fairy tale feeling. It's still unsettling, but it's also fantastical and brutal in ways the film very much isn't. A big connection between these two is that they really tap into themes of religious repression and the dangers of rigid patriarchal society. Both protagonists, Thomathan and Abatha, are women held by forces beyond their control, struggling against accusations, powerlessness, and the suffocating morality of their community. If you were fascinated by how The Witch portrays a young woman pushed to the margins until she finds liberation in the supernatural, you'll find that Slewfoot follows a strikingly similar arc, though with its own twists. Overall, I'd say Slewfoot is an excellent match for The Witch. It shares the same Puritan era setting, the same folk horror DNA, and the same themes of religious repression. But where Eggers' film thrives on restraint and ambiguity, Brom gives you something louder, bloodier, and more unapologetically supernatural. Both are powerful in their own right, and I recommend both. So I made the decision to read one more book for this video to see if I can get a closer companion to The Witch. I've decided to also read The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. I'll take some time to read this and I'll let you know what I thought of it when I finish. So I also read The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson, and while I don't think it's as strong of a match for The Witch as Slewfoot was, there are still some similarities worth pointing out. The story follows Emmanuelle, a young girl living in the rigid religious community of Bethel, where strict rules and oppressive gender roles of this fictional religion dominate every aspect of her life. Her mother was once disgraced for breaking those rules, and Emmanuelle has grown up shamed for her mother's acts. When she wanders into the dark wood one day, she encounters the spirits of witches who were executed long ago, and they gift her mother's diary filled with ominous messages and drawings, including the 4 words repeated: blood, blight, darkness, and slaughter. It's in these early chapters The Year of the Witching definitely channels the atmosphere and tone of The Witch. The isolation of Bethel, the puritanical control of the prophet and his church, and the way the suspicion and fear rules people's lives all feels very reminiscent of Eggers' films. Even the descriptions of the Darkwood has that same haunting folkloric energy that made the setting of The Witch so unsettling. But after the first third, the novel takes a different turn, and Henderson shifts into more of a dark fantasy adventure. The scope of the story expands, the pacing quickens, and the tone and writing borders on YA. She's not nearly as isolated as characters like Abatha and Slewfoot, or Thomasin in The Witch. Instead, she finds allies, discovers her power, and even develops a love interest. The story becomes more about her rebellion and change, and less about the toll of being alone in a hostile, patriarchal world. For that reason, I'd say The Year of the Witching doesn't match The Witch as closely as Slewfoot in my opinion, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth reading. Henderson builds a really vivid fantasy world, and the themes of religious corruption, inheritance, sin, and feminism are all compelling. If you loved The Witch for its oppressive religious setting and themes of feminine resistance, you'll probably enjoy the first third of this book especially. And if you're open to something that leans more into dark fantasy, rebellion, than psychological horror, The Year of the Witching could still be a very rewarding read for you. Between the two, I preferred Slewfoot as a closer companion to The Witch, but The Year of the Witching has its own strengths and could be a good next step if you want a different spin on similar themes. And that wraps up this episode of Silver Scream to Broken Spines. To sum it up, if you're a fan of The Witch and want a book that really captures the haunting atmosphere, period authenticity, and sense of isolation, Slewfoot is the one I'd recommend most strongly. The Year of the Witching is still a solid read with similar themes, but it takes the story in a different, more fantasy-driven direction. Both are definitely worth your time, but Slewfoot felt like a closer companion. Thank you so much for watching. If you've read any of these books or have any other suggestions that capture the vibe of The Witch, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk to you about them. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next episode of Silver Scream to Broken Spines. Here is a sneak peek of the next episode.
Well, the son of a bitch is gonna smell just like the slaughterhouse.
Oh, give the guy a break. He can sit by Franklin.
What do you want to do?
Oh, he's
Kick him
weird
out, man.
looking. No.
I'll catch you next time. Happy reading, everyone.